Hi, everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person today. My name's Annie Nigra. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm going to talk to you about a new study we have about lead water service lines in New York City and how they're associated with neighborhood racial ethnic composition and social vulnerability. And at the end of the talk, I'll tell you about some steps you can take to protect yourself and your family and others in your community from water lead exposure. So lead enters our drinking water by corroding from plumbing materials. It's not really present in the source water that's delivered throughout the city, but rather it can corrode when there's lead as a component in either the water service line that connects a residential building to the water main, or in lead solder or other plumbing materials inside of your building. Water utilities do treat their drinking water to try and prevent that corrosion from happening, but there are examples like Flint, Michigan, where when that corrosion control goes poorly or goes wrong, having a lead service line here can be a real risk factor for high drinking water lead exposure. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocated $115 million to the state of New York in 2022 for lead service line replacement, because replacing these lead service lines is a really critical public health need. But New York State gets to decide where those funds get distributed and which communities get prioritized for service line replacement. Currently, New York State prioritizes communities that are low income, that have older homes, and that have a high percentage of children with elevated blood lead. What we wanted to know was whether these prioritization criteria were adequate for determining the most exposed and most impacted communities when it comes to lead service line replacement. So we wanted to know whether within New York City, lead service lines disproportionately impact communities by their race and ethnicity and by social vulnerability. The first thing we did was we mapped where potential lead service lines occur across the city. So in this map here, purple and black areas indicate neighborhoods that have a higher proportion of lead service lines. So you can see there's a problem here in the Bronx, and there's some problem areas out here in Queens. Over 130,000 service lines to residential buildings are potential lead in the city, and that's about 16% of lines total. We also mapped out lines where the material is unknown. So these lines could contain lead or they could not contain lead. And it's really important that we figure out whether they contain lead or not so we know whether they need to be replaced. These are more evenly distributed throughout the city. They're everywhere. And it's almost a third of all the service lines in the city. In this plot, I'm going to walk you through it. It shows you that communities with higher proportions of Hispanic Latino residents are really at risk of having potential lead service lines. So in gray in the background here, these rectangles represent neighborhoods, and they're the proportion of residents that are Hispanic Latino. So you can see there are a lot of neighborhoods where less than 50% of the residents are Hispanic Latino, and then some neighborhoods where more than 50% of the residents are Hispanic Latino. And the important thing to take away from this graph is that as you have higher proportions of Hispanic Latino residents in a neighborhood, the risk of having a potential lead service line goes up, and this is significant. To quantify this, for every 20% higher proportion of residents in a neighborhood who are Hispanic Latino, there's a 15% higher relative risk of having a potential lead service line. And this is specifically because the percentage of non-Hispanic white residents is lower. We also looked at a child lead exposure vulnerability measure. What we wanted to know was, are children who are already at risk for elevated lead exposure, are they also more likely to be using a lead service line? So this index here, which we've mapped across the city, indicates areas where children are at high risk of lead exposure from all sources, from dust, from paint, from water. And you can see the darker areas like up here in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx are where children are most likely to be exposed to lead from all sources. So communities with children who are already at a high risk of exposure to lead from all sources have an 11% higher relative risk of having a potential lead service line as well. So to conclude, we find that New York City communities that are disproportionately impacted by potential lead service lines are those that are Hispanic Latino and those with children who are already at high risk of elevated lead exposure from all sources. And so our conclusion here is that the New York State's prioritization criteria really needs to support the most impacted and most exposed communities. So what can you do to protect yourself, your family, and your community from drinking water lead exposure? There are two things you can do. The first is to request a free water lead test kit from New York City if you haven't yet done so. There's a QR code here and a link. You can go and request that test kit. You can also consider using a certified filter to reduce lead in water. There are two places you can go to get a really high quality certified lead filter. One is the Water Quality Association. They list the products that they've certified on this webpage. And the other is the National Science Foundation. They also list certified filters here on this webpage. And again, if you have any questions about this study or the implications or how to protect yourself, your family, or your neighbors, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to chat more. Thanks very much.